Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Peter KWON. Peter is an assistant professor of Korean studies at the State University of New York in Albany, and is a previous recipient of the Song-Young Kim postdoctoral fellowship in Korean studies at the Korea Institute at Harvard University. And he is also the author of a significant amount of recent research on the development of South Korea under the Park Chung-hee regime, specifically the nature of this development on dual tracks, which involved the merging of the economic and military sectors. Peter's research breaks down old models and outdated understandings of this period. And from accessing previously restricted data and information, Peter has built up not just the first clear understanding of this period, but also a much clearer understanding of why Korea looks the way it does today. And of course, this traces back to the late 1960s, and with South Korea pinched between two national crises, an emergent and belligerent North Korea, and on the other side, an American regime that was desperate to pull out of the region and to cut its defense commitments to South Korea. So in some ways, quite understandably, Park Chung-hee kicks forward Korea into a gear of economic development and ties that closely to military security. His slogan, "Rich Nation, Strong Military," and a new galvanized national identity around self-reliance. The prime mover in this was Korea's Heavy and Chemical Industrialization Plan, HCIP. And it all came about with a single purpose: to rapidly industrialize Korea and to fill the gaps inside the country that existed as a result of the rebuilding after the Korean War, the slow emergence of the South Korean state, and importantly, the use of America as an economic and military crux. All this to be highly centralized under the Blue House, under the upper echelon of the Park Chung-hee government. To buttress this was the Yushin Constitution and the declaration of a national emergency in December 1971. And from the outside looking in, this does feel like an increasingly militarized society, all the way down to the ideology. Economic development and the growth of industry was being treated almost as equivalent to military service. Slogans championing the need for sacrificial devotion and increased hard work began emerging at this time. And importantly, to grow in this way, South Korea had to change fundamentally. It had to rapidly upskill its workforce. It had to fill in huge gaps in infrastructure. And it had to find a way in which growth would not just be pushed along at a rapid pace, but from which it would also be sustained despite the inevitable setbacks along the way. And from this comes the rise of the Chaebol, or the large family-owned conglomerates inside South Korea. The need to move quickly meant that the existing industries were the ones in which the government personally backed, and then incentivized again and again to not just expand its operations, but to diversify into multiple areas. This was a synergy between the private and the public sector, with the public supporting the private growth all the way, and then giving out government contracts, and most importantly military contracts, to these Chaebol to ensure that both sectors would develop at the same pace. And the cross-pollination is heavily apparent. Companies developing cars would also develop tanks. Those developing ships would also develop the navy, and this is a process that ran all the way down through the economy, all the way down to light armaments. And there are obvious comparisons here with the American military-industrial complex that so many people talk about these days. But importantly, coming from this research is what it dispels, the myths it cracks about South Korea at this time. The new light in which it forces us to look upon this period in South Korean development, and of course a clearer understanding of the way the South Korean economy and the South Korean military remain connected today, and the important role that the Chaebol still hold inside the country. And from here out, I'll let Peter explain the finer details of this. But of course, as tends to be the case, we didn't have enough time to get through some of the fundamentals here, and a lot of the key details. There's just too much to go through. So in the link below this podcast, I'm going to put some of the articles that I used as research for this interview. And I encourage listeners to go there, read them for themselves, and get a much broader understanding of this era. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider donating to the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Or failing that, you can simply share, like, or comment on this podcast across social media. All the help, no matter how small it is appreciated. On that, and to walk us through the role that the defense industry has played in the economic transformation of South Korea, this is Peter KWON. Peter KWON, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Hi, Jed. It's a pleasure to be here virtually.
Yes, absolutely. And your research is quite a unique brand of research here. And I don't tend to start interviews this way. I don't tend to get people to introduce their research. But yours comes from a lot of new primary documents And it tends to dispel an awful lot of myths that people have developed around the past of Korea. So there tends to be this idea that America has played an overbearing role in the development of the Korean military and the Korean state as well in terms of its economy. And I might get you now to introduce some of your research, because this begins to give a new direction on this and a new understanding of just where we have come from in the development of Korea.
Yes. So I'll start off maybe perhaps by introducing the sources that I use for my research and how the sources led to some of the conclusions in my work. So a lot of the primary sources I draw are from a place called the Presidential Archives of the National Archives of South Korea, or in Korean 대통령 기록관. I ran into this archive actually back in 2012. I actually went to Korea for field research with a different research topic in mind. Then one day, while doing the archival research at the Presidential Archives, I ran into some of this military data, and I soon realized that these military data were, ever used, very rarely used, very rarely tapped into by the scholars. And for example, there was archives related to so-called the 율곡 operation, 율곡 사업, and is a clandestine, military operation that was ran by the Park Chung-hee regime from 1974 to 1979. Then I realized, these were very recently declassified materials, and again, not many scholars have really tapped into it. And that's how, my whole research journey has started. My topic on the defense industry of Korea. And from then on, I explore some new materials, newly declassified materials in other institutes, such as from the Ministry of National Defense, Agency for Defense Development, which was a central institute for the weapons R&D in South Korea. Then that led to me to expand my network of the people who actually used to work under Park Chung-hee. And so it started from the archival, then I expanded into more of a oral history. And so that's how the journey started.
So let's begin to build this story up then and go to some of the deep history here that will then build into your research. Let's go to this idea that many people might be familiar with already about the Park Chung-hee era, and this idea of self-reliance and I suppose the motivation for this particular era and this particular military and economic development. So there were two shocks or two pressures that were pushing Park Chung-hee in this way, at least as it seems here. North Korea from one direction, and the fear of an American abandonment, I suppose, from the other direction.
Yes. So 1968, we have a series of provocations, military provocations by North Korea. The most famous one being actually two of them, two incidents. The Pueblo incident, where North Korea abducted the U.S. intelligence ship into international water, and the second incident, 2 days before that, where North Korea sent the commandos to actually assassinate Park Chung-hee at the Blue House. So this triggered a huge crisis in South Korea. There was a big alarm. But the U.S. response at the time was very, you could say, lackluster, or not as aggressive as South Korea expected it to be. So in that context, this is when Park Chung-hee decided to pursue so-called 자주국방, self-reliant national defense. And that became sort of, actually the national slogan throughout the 1970s, because all throughout the whole decade, there was always this talk from the U.S. side of withdrawing the entire troops from South Korea, which the South Korea completely relied on until the late 1960s. And we have to remember, until late 1960s, South Korea could not even manufacture its own guns or ammunition, completely dependent on the U.S. weapon imports. Whereas North Korea at the time could already produce AK-47 through the Soviet military aid. It already had its own munitions plan. So in terms of a military capability, North Korea was far ahead. So this is what, sort of a context that triggered Park Chung-hee's self-reliant national defense policy.
And we get these slogans. Once again, people may be familiar with these as well. The idea of rich nation, strong military,
Yes.
and quotes, and I suppose phrases like "let's fight while rebuilding." So from these very early stages, it feels like the economic development and the military development had exactly the same purpose, as in you cannot have one without the other. And I suppose the future of the South Korean country was at risk here.
Absolutely. And so the slogan was a 부국 강병, as you said, a rich nation, strong military, or some people translate it into as a rich nation, strong army. Actually, as a precedent in the Japanese, the Meiji era, 19th century, the Fukoku Kyohei in Japanese. And as you mentioned, it basically implied this parallel development of the military and the economy, which Park Chung-hee also, he adopted and used it as his own official slogan. And it's basically the interdependent mutual pursuit of military power and the national economic development, and became sort of a blueprint that Park Chung-hee set up. And you can see that all the following the ROK, the South Korean regime, sort of pursued it as their own blueprint throughout, actually, the post-Park Chung-hee era, until even today, you could say.
And this period, in some ways, is also the motivation for Park's declaration of a national emergency, and it feels like, in some ways, also the Yushin restoration. So this idea is not just a motivational thing. It's not just a let's work hard for our nation. It also comes along with a grave national security threat in terms of there is a security imputation here as well. So at the same time that the nation is being encouraged to develop and grow, there is also a huge internal national security crackdown as well happening at the same time.
Absolutely. And, there are some debates, though, on Park's motivation for, triggering this new defense posture and system. You could say, yes, on one hand, there was definitely the security crisis that was, inspired by the North Korean crisis and the U.S. plan for, the withdrawal of troops. On the other hand, though, more scholars have been arguing that there was also, the political motive that, inspire Park Chung-hee to set up the Yushin that could potentially perpetuate his rule. And he could justify that based on the self-reliant national defense to strengthen the national security. And what other better justification to prolong his rule? So there are both sides of there are you could say a debate going on what led Park Chung-hee to implement the Yushin, also the self-reliant national defense policy.
And the nature of this economic growth that Park had in mind, this becomes a highly centralized process under almost direct guidance from the Blue House itself. So this isn't a free market liberalization. This is a deeply held national growth from I suppose, a very small number of people and a very small apex of power.
So, the Korean economic development model, many people use the term the developmental state, comparing South Korea's developmental path to, for example, Japan or the East Asian newly industrialized economies. They also implemented the technocracy based on these very small number of technocrats who implemented and planned the economic policymaking. But in South Korea case, it was exceptionally, you could say, a small number of a crew who actually guided the national economic policymaking. And this was also another unique aspect is the fact that this was all concentrated in the Blue House. It wasn't a separate economic ministries like the MITI in MITI in Japan or IDB in Taiwan, or usually the countries, the ministries are in charge of guiding the economic policy. But in South Korea, it was within the Blue House. It was and also especially there's a office called the Second Economic Secretariat, which was also in the charge of defense industry, in sync with the heavy and chemical industrialization. So this was a central institute. They worked directly with Park Chung-hee to develop the defense industry in sync with heavy and chemical industrialization. And this is what made the Korean economic development, I think, very unique, very distinct compared to other so-called East Asian developmental states.
So let's dig a bit deeper into that process then and this idea, because the range of this development, for some people that have studied the development of Korea in isolation, it is an incredibly broad process here. So this period that we're speaking about, this rapid industrialization, this is only a 7 or 8 year period in my understanding, and yet they move from basically having nothing in this period to developing extremely high level industries. So shipbuilding industries, petrochemical, steel industry, electronic industry. So just I might get to touch on just how rapid this process is and just how rare it is to move forward this quickly from a low level of manufacturing with basically nothing to an incredibly high level, incredibly expensive level, and incredibly, I suppose, resource-dependent level of development.
Park Chung-hee implemented the HCI policy, or the heavy and chemical industrialization, in 1973. And of course, it lasted until his assassination in 1979. So during that period, not only was Park able to develop the defense industry almost from scratch. I say almost, and I can explain later. There are some continuities from 1960s, you could say, but it's still from 1973, 1979, you could say there's an unprecedented industrial revolution, and it was a very much center, I would argue, or at least inspired by the defense industrialization, or the need for South Korea to modernize its military independently outside of the United States. And it was, you could say, compared to any other nations, it became not only a defense manufacturer, but exporter of the weapons from the late 1970s. So it was an incredible, you could say, achievement and a legacy of Park Chung-hee. But at the same time, you cannot just, I guess there's a something I would like to also mention that maybe I didn't articulate in my article is that there was also the massive United States military aid until late 1960s, through especially South Korea's participation in the Vietnam War. There was a Brown memo which promised huge amount of U.S. technical data package to South Korea, but it subsidized South Korea's military to a certain extent. It was very inadequate, you could say. And this is why South Korea saw its own need to develop also, its military through an independent plan from 1973 under the HCI. So you could say, though, the 1968 security crisis accelerated the military modernization process that Park Chung-hee actually wanted to pursue since the beginning of his regime. Even the idea of HCI, heavy and chemical industries, this didn't just start out of nowhere from 1970s. Actually, there were some discussions of HCI. Also, the Park Chung-hee always wanted to strengthen the military power, but it was in 1968 that really triggered, you could say, not trigger, maybe the better word is accelerated Korea's heavy and chemical industrialization and the military modernization. In 1973, this is when they officially pursued it. And also you have to think about, there's also the reduced U.S. military aid from 1974. And also there's ongoing talks about full withdrawals of U.S. troops. So even though there are ideas of a HCI in the defense industry in the 1960s, 1968, accelerate the planning process of the defense industrialization and the implementation HCI. In 1973, that's when they officially implemented it. But nonetheless, you could say the official time frame of HCI again is 1973 to 1979, and this is when also the South Korea's own indigenous defense industry was implemented. So you could say, as you said, it was extremely accelerated, hyper growth process. And what made it even more, remarkable is the economic feat that they were able to do this simultaneously, which North Korea actually tried to do since 1960s, but it failed. The Pyeongjin policy that Kim Il-sung pursued, Pyeongjin also means sort of a side-by-side policy or parallel policy for economic and military development. He pursued it since 1960s, but it never really was very, you could say, productive or was as successful as how Park Chung-hee pursued it in the 1970s.
So let's talk a bit more about the heavy and chemical industrialization process here, this HCI. So why does this become the pillar? Why does this become the core factor here in the development of Korea? Is it because this is so for those people like myself who are laymen on these technical terms, is this because it is a sector that is necessary for the military development, or is it simply the most underdeveloped sector inside the country and therefore the one that needs to catch up the most? So why the focus on this particular aspect of the Korean economy and Korean development?
That is a central question. Why HCI, and how did that actually contribute to also the economic development, the military modernization? Why was this policy at the center of the Park Chung-hee's industrial revolution? And the answer is, so the 6 heavy and chemical industries, the steel, heavy machinery, shipbuilding, the 4th one, chemical and petrochemical, and also the 5th industry, special metals or non-ferrous metals. The last one, the electronics. I mean, at the time when Park Chung-hee started pursuing HCI, we have to go back. How South Korea was very much focused on the light industries, mostly the non-sophisticated, labor-intensive, industries that was very much limited, and South Korea did not require, for example, a lot of the technical expertise or the highly sophisticated technology for those. So there's a shift to these much more advanced so-called heavy and chemical industries. And not only they actually form the foundation for the South Korean economic growth, but these are actually very crucial to defense manufacturing. So you could say the HCI was at first, it was developed, it was accelerated in the late 1970s due to South Korea's military needs, because you need the steel, you need the heavy machinery, you need shipbuilding, chemical, as well as special metals, electronics, in order to develop the arms, the weapons, the tanks, the armored vehicle. But eventually, with the growth of these key industries, they contribute to South Korea's, for example, the export economy. South Korea could develop its own steel, its own ships, its own like a machinery, and and you could there's a so-called the spin-out effect, where these military technology could later be used for the civilian products, for example, the cars, the automobiles, the railroads, for example, and eventually much later on the GPS, all the military technology being used for the commercial economy. And these set the foundation for South Korea, as you could say, the expo-led industrialization, and this is precisely the reason why Park Chung-hee or his technocrats pursue the HCI, because of the dual purpose. These were the dual purpose industry, not exclusively for military or just for the economy, but they could do it together. And this was a time-saving measure, you could say, because South Korea could not afford to build its own defense industry from scratch, nor could it just exclusively focus on the military due to the threats from North Korea and the impending withdrawal of U.S. troops. So they had to, pursue these simultaneously, and this is why the HCI, was at the core, and it worked.
And I have to assume here that at the same time, when you develop this quickly, both in terms of economic development and military development, you leave behind a gap of sorts, and that is a labor gap, and that is a skilled labor gap. So the idea, again, this synergy between the private sector and the public sector, I'm assuming must have bled quite heavily into this aspect as well, because you need once again an indigenous labor sector here. And of course, at least from my understanding, South Korea didn't import its labor at this time; it built it up just as it was building up its economy.
Yes. So as you mentioned, another dimension of this HCI process that was quite remarkable was the fact that there's a rapid advancement of a skilled workforce, and it's something I mentioned in my article, Mars and Mana, the development of a skilled workers, and these happened under the policy that sort of supported the HCI, and there's a policy called military procurement law that Park Chung-hee implemented in February 1973. And one of the policies under this law included the development of a skilled labor. And Park Chung-hee did through very multifaceted, multidimensional measures, building vocational schools, and the technical high schools. And there are a lot of reward system for these skilled workers who develop the technical skills and pass the technical license, and who worked in the HCI and the defense industry. There are special rewards for these people, also for the scientists and the engineers. So there's this mass mobilization of workers training. And there you have this first generation of a skilled workforce actually emerging in 1970s in sync with the development of the HCI. And many of these workers that I interviewed in Korea, they, like I said, they reaped a lot of rewards from the state policies. And of course, it was a very hard work. Many of them work 60, 70 hours a week, in a very, you could say, difficult factory settings, because there was always a state quota mandated, and they had to follow, whatever the state had to tell them. But, many of them most of them, they skipped the compulsory military service that all the South Korean men had to, fulfill. So instead of going to military, they work in one of the defense or the defense/HCI factories for 5 years. So there are various policies to support their development and their work in these factories.
And how publicly known was this process? Because we're talking not just about economic development, but military development, of course, here. So how publicly known was the process? I mean, a lot of military development, of course, is clandestine. They don't want to get the information out there. They may tell people that they are developing a military, but they don't want to specifically tell just how they're doing it here. And one of the things that was going off in my head as we talk this through is, if you mesh the public and the private so heavily, there is a risk, or a potential risk, of military secrets coming out the back end here, coming out through the economic aspect. But at least from my reading of your research here, Park Chung-hee and his regime did quite a good job of keeping a lot of this military development quite clandestine.
Absolutely. So this is why another reason why the South Korean HCI, the economic development, was very distinct, because it was extremely top-down. As I said, the people at the top who actually planned these policies were very few, very handful. For example, for the aforementioned, the Yugok operation, the clandestine military operation, there at the Blue House, there's a so-called the Blue House, 5-member committee who, basically decided all the policy measures and told the different ministries exactly what to do. But only people who actually had the whole picture of this military-civilian convergence were people at the very top. And there's a very concentrated development, you could say. So there are different ministries. Of course, the entire industries and the resources are completely mobilized. But it was started from the very top, extremely centralized policymaking. And even people who work in the defense factories, many of them actually did not know sometimes what they're doing. Sometimes the government would tell them, okay, develop this part. But the government would sometimes not tell them for what purpose. Let's say a propellant technology that some of these defense workers had to develop. And I interviewed a lot of the scientists, engineers who work in the defense plants. Sometimes they did not even know what the other team or other division in the same corporations were doing. This is how secretive it was. And of course, there's a surveillance everywhere. At the time, you have to also remember North Korean espionage going on in these South Korean industrial factories in the 1970s. And there are a lot of newspaper articles that feature how a lot of these North Korean spies were caught in working at this top, the Chaebol corporations. So it was a very secretive, very clandestine, even at the corporate level. And because of this very deep convergence between the private and the public sector, the government, even though Chaebol are private corporation, they sometimes almost ran like sort of a public sector companies. But I think one thing that Park Chung-hee, the policymakers, did it rather in a brilliant fashion was the fact that they were able to utilize the strength of the private sector for the public sector purpose. The entire process was very secretive. Even the HCI in the public, Park Chung-hee would not describe it as a defense industry development. HCI, you could say, was almost like a disguise for defense industry. When Park Chung-hee introduced it in January 1973, he did not mention it as anything about the defense industry. Even though if you look at the actual HCI documents published by the HCI office, government ministries, there's nothing about the defense industry. And again, this was at the time that U.S. Banned South Korea, right, from developing dangerous weapon technology, because U.S. was very afraid about, South Korea potentially triggering arms development, arms race in East Asia. So there's a, U.S., the South Korea's ally, trying to suppress, South Korea's weapon procurement. And there's North Korea. So of course, HCI again was a sort of disguise, you could say, for defense industrialization, and that's how much. How secretive. Now we can talk about, yes, HCI defense industry and vice versa. This is how it was. But back then, not many people exclusively describe HCI as a defense center industrialization. This is something that became known much later on.
And you mentioned there a couple of times the Chaebol. So let's introduce them in a bit more detail here.
Absolutely.
And build them out a bit here. So as we've been talking through this mesh between the private and the public sector, Park Chung-hee, of course, naturally moves into this this area where he wants to move. He wants to develop quite quickly. And of course, to do this, it's hard to build up industry from scratch. It's hard to build up private enterprise from scratch. So he naturally falls back on the large conglomerates that already exist, the large family-owned conglomerates that already exist inside the country. And so I might get you introduced just how this marriage, unique to the Korean situation, this marriage between the private and the public sector has happened, and how it affects, and it still exists largely today as well.
At the time, when Park Chung-hee tried to develop the defense industry, South Korea could not really afford to build like a munitions plant, or state-owned munitions plant from scratch. One reason being the reduce, the U.S. military aid. And also, South Korea simply did not have time to, build everything from scratch, because of also the schedule. U.S. trying to now withdraw the U.S. troops, and at the same time, there's increasing infiltration from North Korea from late 1960s. So, how do you build defense scratch in the most, the quickest, most efficient, while maximizing the available resources? And this is through using the factories that the Chaebol or these large conglomerate corporations already had at the time. Actually at the time, I'm not sure we can even call them Chaebol. These were just big corporations, sometimes family owned. At the same, like the corporations like Kia, Hyundai, Hanwha. They were not. They're very different from the Chaebol that we know today. Now we know them as this diversified, the multi-sectoral, conglomerate. At the time, they were not as diversified. At the time, they actually were, picked by the government to become the defense manufacturers. But they actually diversified through the process of defense manufacturing, because the aforementioned law that I talked about, 1973 February, the military procurement law, as soon as these corporations join to become the defense manufacturer, the state even pour even more resources. Of course, there was a Chaebol government cooperation going back to much prior to that. But however, it was 1970s under the HCI and under the military procurement law, where a lot of these, the Korean corporations received massive scientific, technological, financial aid to develop, to enable the domestic arms production, right? So, but going back to your original questions, these companies, like today, many of them are very renowned, the international exporters, and you could say that it's precisely because South Korea tapped into their resources and developed them, groomed them throughout the 1970s. They continued to grow, and many of them, you could say, put at the forefront of not just Korea's military modernization, but eventually the economic modernization. So this was a very important tactic by Park Chung-hee regime.
And what sort of benefits were given to these Chaebol? So I assume there must have been an awful lot of tax breaks, of course, a lot of incentives to grow, yes, and a lot of benefits there as well. But there must have also been a lot of, I suppose, support for investments in a sense, as in your investments can last, they can sustain. And if they don't go as we would expect, the loans will still come in and support would still survive, because this is a rapid growth area. Mistakes are bound to happen and you're going to overreach in some areas. So there must have been a type of at least implicit support for the survival of these businesses?
So the Ministry of Commerce and Industries, MCI, really really took the lead in helping these companies to grow. One of the things, for example, it did was build these large industrial complexes. For example, the Changwon industrial complex is a hub of the machinery production in South Korea. It still is today. And by giving companies, allowing companies to go there and actually helping them to fund their factory building, for example, and also giving them a lot of scientific, technological aid through joint ventures with the foreign companies. For example, the Kia, government wanted Kia, the famous, Kia Junggongop, to develop, the artillery or the armored vehicles, and state gave them loans and financial aid to form joint venture with the renowned foreign companies, sometimes in the United States, sometimes in other places, to build these armored vehicles, and gave them funds and loans to also build the factories in place like the Changwon Industrial Complex. And this is how these companies were able to mass produce the weapon parts, a lot of weapon, the sophisticated the machinery parts, for example, and also giving them there's a place called Agency for Defense Development, ADD. Again, this is the Central Institute in South Korea for the weapons R&D, and a lot of the ADD scientists actually work together with these company R&D teams to develop indigenous weapons technology, and of course later they'll transfer to the civilian industrial sector and the civilian workforce, and that could be used in that sense as well.
And how isolated were the Chaebol and these companies from international forces at the time? Of course, they had a lot of government backing at the time, but the HCI, of course, is a rapid development process, but it's also got an international eye for it, because, of course, there's a competition with not with America leaving and with a risk from North Korea here. And there comes a point when you are exporting a lot of what you develop, and you are exporting some of the arms, exporting some of your manufacturing here, that you have to get exposed to international standards and international competition, I suppose. So how much domestic competition were there for these contracts, if any at all? And how much were these companies and Korea in itself exposed to international competition at the time?
Yeah, so one of the key aspects of Park Chung-hee's HCI policy was, it was, as you said, very much export-oriented. And from the very beginning, I mean, Park Chung-hee and his technocrats understood the limitations of the domestic market. They wanted to manufacture items, not just for the domestic purposes, but also to drive South Korea's economic process as an export-led nation. This was from the very beginning, you could say, from the formulation, at the start of formulation of HCI. So HCI, again, the dual-purpose industries, they develop the weapon parts, but a lot of these parts could be also used for the commercial products, the manufactured products that could be exported.
And how deep were the spin-on and spin-off effects of this thing? Because this sounds like a deep, cross-fertilization of society at its most fundamental level here, that everything is tied to everything else. It sounds in some ways like almost like a risky strategy here, that you commit so much in so few hands, and it is entirely based on, I suppose it is an all-or-nothing process here, that these large companies like Kia and Hyundai and Air Korea and people like this, as you're reading through your research here, they have their hand in almost everything, because they're incentivized to expand as fast as possible and touch on as many things as possible, because that's what the Korean nation needs as a whole, not necessarily as what their business is, I suppose, what would be a good business decision in itself. So this sounds, at least on paper, like a risky process, but I suppose once you look at it in terms of a cross-fertilization or in terms of spin-on, spin-off effects, that it has some value in as far as this growth and this development, even if it's not economically successful in one area, it has military effects and military benefits in the other, and I suppose this goes back and forth.
Absolutely, and we have to remember, South Korea was not the first country to pursue this very intricate, deep convergence between the private and the public sector. For example, Japan, dual purpose industries, even today. A lot of the industries and the technology that Japan has been developing, even though it spends very little, much smaller proportion of its GDP on its self-defense force. Because these industries are dual-purpose industries, they're effectively serving both military and the economic purposes. And, like I said, Japan has this very long history of, the military economic parallel development going back to the Fukoku Kyoe, maybe even before that. But South Korea, same. It became this dual pursuit of a military and development became like a blueprint for South Korea ever since then. And so for a lot of these corporations, even maybe in public, maybe even to this day, many corporations deny that they're willingly participating in the military production. But you could almost say these, the public sector objectives became almost synchronized with their privatized interest. It's just how deeply they were converged in the 1970s, and you could say these companies have continue since on, and not just because of the ideological or national interest reasons, but even industrially, technologically, like ADD, for example, again, Agency for Defense Development is a public research institute, it's been working so closely with these the Chaebol corporations for a very long time for the R&D, for the technological imports and the transfers. ADD was the one that imported a lot of these sophisticated military technologies from the U.S. or other renowned manufacturers, and then distribute them to the civilian corporation. So there's this infrastructural collaboration that goes back to 1970s, and also a lot of the HCI technology came from the government private sector collaboration to also develop the new the industrial products. Government built many research institutes in the 1970s, and some of them in late 1960s. So and these research institutes work very closely with the Chaebol corporations and their engineers to engineer new products. So this convergence was very deep, and even today it's an ongoing process. And as I said, it became sort of a blueprint for the modern Korean economy today.
And there is a comparison that many people listening to this will start to ping in their ears, and it's something that you mentioned in your research as well, that this seems to have relevance for the American situation. So post Second World War, the American state has a similar kind of mesh in between the military and the economic development. And of course, people always throw this reference out there, often in quite derogatory terms, of the military industrial complex, this idea that the military is so tied to economic development that it's hard to break the two things up, and they are, I suppose, almost becoming one in themselves. So how close is the comparison with the American situation in your eyes? And were the Park regime themselves conscious of mimicking this form of American development?
U.S., of course, as a traditional, you could say, supplier of the military economic aid to South Korea. Also, of course, as the mutual defense treaty, that goes back to 1950s. The U.S. has been many people say the traditional patron state of South Korea. So of course, when Park Chung-hee came to power, him and his technocrats tried to design. They look at United States as a model, and already in 1960 there's some discussion of using military and economic power for in a more synchronized manner. Of course, and HCI is the one that manifested it. But the United States, as you could say, a much longer history of developing this privatized military defense industry structure. For them, I mean, it starting from, especially from the World War II, when it started mobilizing the private sectors, it had much longer time to develop that collaborative structure between the public and private sector for the military production. Whereas South Korea's case, really from 1973 to 1979 was much more condensed process time frame. So you could say that for South Korea, it took them much shorter time to develop that, the defense economic structure compared to the United States. But yes, the U.S. The model of a privatized defense industry has been discussed in a lot of the policy, documents under the Park Chung-hee regime, and definitely Park Chung-hee's technocrats had an eye on the United States, also the Japan. So you could say very two powerful, example or precedent examples for South Korean technocrats were Japan and the United States. And this is why South Korea, unlike North Korea or Soviet Union and China, that developed the weapons production based on the state industries, South Korea decided to tap into the private sector. And this is very reminiscent of what actually the United States was doing, has been doing at the time. So I'm sure it served as an inspiration for the HCI technocrats.
So before we get on to how the HCI survived in, I suppose, towards the end of the Park era and after his assassination, you touched on something at the very beginning of this podcast that I've noted down here, I have to bring back up. And this is one of those interesting things, I suppose, in history. I remember back during a long time ago, during my years in university, being told quite directly that South Korea was a quote developmental state here, and this, of course, this is I suppose it's an East Asian idea, but not just, and that is these countries like Taiwan and Japan, they all have the same mode for development. But your research here is in many ways breaking this model down here, at least breaking it down for how it applies to Korea. So I might open that up a little bit more. So when people talk about a developmental state, what exactly are they referring to? And I suppose after that, how is it that this research of yours is breaking South Korea away from this model?
Absolutely. I mean, developmental state, again, it's a very complex, I could say, a model has evolved into many different forms and versions, and even to this day, I mean, I don't know if there's a one singular definition of a developmental state, but the broad idea basically based on this idea that a state, a very strong state, with the dominant bureaucracy, depoliticized bureaucracy, led the state for the economic development, and many examples, as you mentioned, South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan. I mean, they had a very strong elite bureaucracy system that was able to plan and implement the state economic policy making to guide the entire process. So in that regard, South Korea, I mean, it's not wrong, I would say, to label or categorize South Korea as one of the developmental states, but I guess the more accurate description would be to describe it as a variant example of a developmental state. It did have a very strong bureaucracy, strong state. It did have a depoliticized state that led the society to engineer, to guide the economic growth. But if you look at the actual details, and this is what makes it possible through the declassified data, we can look at the nuances, the actual very intricate small details and the different components that make Korea's experience very distinctive from other so-called developmental states. For example, South Korea's economic development process was very much driven for the defense needs. It was very defense inspired, defense in the late 1960s and 1970s, and those are the periods that kickstarted the so-called the miracle of the Han River, or the South Korean economic miracle. So in that regard, the fact that it was so military oriented at the start, and it was driven by that particular needs, I think that's what makes South Korea economic model you could say distinct from for example, Taiwan or even Japan. So also the fact that it was extremely clandestine process where there were only very handful of policymakers under Park who are in charge of this entire process. And that makes it, I think, also very unique. Even though, yes, the developmental state model does talk about the top-down policymaking, but in South Korea's case, we have to remember it's not the ministries, the economic bureaucrats. It's these engineers who were put into the brew house, became the so-called the technocrats, and there are very handful of them who actually, with full trust of President Park Chung-hee, engineer and guided this entire process. And these handful of people, of course, they made so many enemies on the way, but it was because they had so much power given to them by mandated by Park Chung-hee himself. So that's what makes again this Korean economic development model, I think, very very interesting and unique.
So let's talk about the breakdown of some of this model. Now, in many ways, it still survives today. People still see the Chaebol, and there still is a close mesh between the military and the economic sector and the private sector and the public sector inside Korea. But it seems, pretty soon after the assassination of Park in 1979, there is a change underway. So as with Chun Doo-hwan and then the No Tae-woo administrations, it seems pretty quickly that the overemphasis on these on the heavy and light chemical industries begins to at least shrink in some ways. And there's some, I suppose, problems that may have been brewing for some time begin to at least be manifested, or at least have more light shed on them. So some of the oligarchical control, some of the overemphasis and centralization of the economy also becomes a problem here. The idea of presidential guidance, or too much presidential guidance, becomes a challenge. So it seems to break down quite quickly at this time. So I might get to walk us through this period and just what happens at this time.
Absolutely. So after assassination of Park Chung-hee in 1979, of course, we have another military coup d'état by former General Chun Doo-hwan, and his rule lasted from 1980 to, of course, all the way until 1988. And Park Chung-hee, of course, at the time was Chun Doo-hwan was a very eager or desperate for the United States sport. And we have to remember that before Chun Doo-hwan came into power, U.S. was struggling. There was this power struggle between United States, especially the State Department, and the Park Chung-hee over Park Chung-hee's nuclear missile development. And U.S. of course have been wanted Park Chung-hee to shut down a lot of these the military operations that Park Chung-hee was secretly pursuing. So Chun Doo-hwan, by giving up a lot of these weapon pursuits by former President Park Chung-hee, wanted to gain more political support from the United States for his new military regime. And this is why, when Chun Doo-hwan came to power, after his presidency, he decides to considerably shut down a lot of the military, the projects, the funding, downscaling the Agency for Defense Development, because this, this was a central institute in charge of weapons R&D, and the U.S., of course, I'm sure, was not very fond of ADD because it was it's basically a place where a lot of new weapon technologies were being developed. So ADD scientists, a lot of them were they lost jobs there, and a lot of them went into the civilian sector, and of course used their know-how for the civilian economic growth. But anyhow, that's one of the reasons why Chun Doo-hwan reduced a lot of the defense, the military, the fundings, and downscaling the military operations and projects to please the United States for the political backing. And so at this time, also Chun Doo-hwan imported, instead of continuing to pursue Park Chung-hee's sort of indigenous development of a weapons R&D for the domestic weapon technology. Instead of pursuing that, Chun Doo-hwan started importing the U.S. weapons, and that's another tactic that deviated from Park Chung-hee's the independent weapons development. So it started U.S. So South Korea started importing just the full U.S. weapons instead of making its own domestic weapons. So that, of course, impacted the defense industry to a large extent. And many of these Chaebol corporations that were receiving massive unconditional support under the Park Chung-hee regime, stopped receiving the same level of support by the government, because the government was not as interested in developing the domestic R&D. So there are less technological scientific support given by the government to these, the Chaebol corporations for defense production. There's a downsizing of the ADD that affects the weapons, the technology that was, being pursued by, the ADD and the Chaebol corporations. And of course, they, South Korea become reliant on the U.S. imported weapons again, just like from like 1950s and 60s. So this all, of course, drastically affected the domestic defense industry. And you can see that 1980s, you can say, was almost stalled the defense industrialization. And really, and from the rise of, the subsequent South Korean leaders who wanted to develop less militarized development, continue to sort of downscale the defense manufacturing. But however, I think starting from Kim Dae-jung, ironically, considering that he was a liberal president, he was the one who sort of resuscitated the domestic R&D development, and presidents after him, in a way, you could say generally resuscitated and continue to cultivate the South Korea's weapons R&D. So you could say, there's the blueprint of Park Chung-hee's blueprint. It continue in although in a very different form, it did continue, and there's still emphasis on this parallel economic security development, hand in hand. So the Chonduan's sort of a detrimental impact on defense industry. It impacted defense industry in a short run, but in the long run, eventually the ROK regime, South Korean regimes, revert back to Park Chung-hee's strategy.
And you've just touched on it quite heavily there, but I might get it as a last question here, just to build up the idea of that present moment here. So for many ways, it feels like, so as you mentioned, the Chaebol has had its challenges, it's had to reform, in some ways it has, some ways it hasn't, and it's gone through those sort of roller coaster rides here. But there's a feeling inside Korea today that they still have this focus on self-reliance. And I wonder how you see this in terms of, because anyone that follows South Korean politics sees that there's always a talk, no matter who is in charge or who is not, there's always talk of the US alliance and the potential for it to not so much break up, but for the American military to leave one day. And it's always at the forefront of people's minds. So I wonder how prescient you see that still today, the idea, or at least the survival of Park's message of self-reliance here.
Yeah, and thank you for the question. I mean, I think that is the central theme of this national narrative of the Korean people, actually throughout the post-war period. But it's the Park Chung-hee who really tapped into that sentiment and manifested into this intense defense center industrialization under his campaign of a self-reliant national defense. And I mean, the spirit of this self-reliance really goes back, I think, to, we have to talk about briefly, long time ago in Korean history. I mean, from late 19th century, even before that, there's the Korean sort of a craving, the hunger for the national autonomy from 1919 March 1st movement, the Wilsonian, the moment. There's this universal declaration for the self-determination of all nations that inspired the national leaders to gain political economy from Japan when Korea was colonized under the Japanese colonial rule. Then also the national division and the Civil War. That was heavily intervened by the foreign forces during the Cold War. Then even after the liberation, both Koreas, North and South, constantly trying to pave their own path from their patron states, North Korea from the Soviet Union and China, South Korea from United States. So, it's Park Chung-hee, you could say, really tapped into this national sentiment of Korean people for, to make this into sort of a master narrative of the Korean people. And from then on, really, the Korean people, they just carrying the torch. Even those people who dislike Park Chung-hee, or people who like Park Chung-hee, whether or not it sort of you could say this a narrative of self-reliance powerfully just merged with the Korean national identity and the Korean sentiment, and it's something that became a sacred doctrine for the Korean people, whether they are liberals or conservatives. So and of course even at the policy level, even the politicians or the policymakers, the Ministry of National Defense in South Korea, they all honor this. There's one thing that the Korean people will not argue against, that their national self-reliance as an ultimate aim, whether it is practical or not. Of course, in this globalized world, it is unrealistic, you could say, but the idea still drives these, you could say, South Korea's drive for the campaign for the military, the strengthening, the economic strengthening. Also, you could say even the reunification, the process. I mean, because the ultimate goal is not just self-reliance of the South Korean people, but entire Korean people in both Koreas. So you could say this ideology, playing a powerful role implicitly and indirectly in both in the military aspect, also in political aspect as well.
Well, that's a great note to leave things on here. So I've based my research for this on a huge number of articles of Peter's that I am going to link below this podcast. I encourage people to go and read them for themselves. They're based on a huge number of primary resources, so we have no chance of getting through them in a single podcast, but I do encourage listeners to go and read them for themselves. I will link as many as possible below. Peter KWON, thanks a lot for coming on the Korean Out podcast.
Thank you, Jed. Appreciate it.